Good morning, everyone. We are so delighted to have you here, and I'm going to just briefly introduce our new CEO. We at the Carter Center are so very happy to have Marianne Peters, Ambassador Marianne Peters, formerly Ambassador to Bangladesh, former Provost of the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. I was going to say Washington, D.C., but that is wrong. And I remember she said that the goal of the Naval War College is to prevent war. So we are here with the same motives in mind, and we are delighted to have her heading up the Carter Center. We are really delighted, and I turn it over to Ambassador Peters.
Thank you very much, Karen, and I want to add my welcome to Karen's to this Human Rights Defenders Forum at the Carter Center, my first, and it's a privilege to be here. As all of you know by now, this event is one of the Carter Center's flagship activities. We convene human rights leaders to discuss pressing issues and to consult about possible collaborative efforts we might undertake to keep the momentum going and make progress for women and girls around the world. Since 2011, we have explored the role of religion in the suppression or advancement of women's rights, and this is the third forum where that vital discussion has been one of the main themes. Now, I think it will be obvious to all of you that what makes this event special is the involvement of our founder, actually our founders, former President Jimmy Carter and Mrs. Rosalynn Carter. President Carter, as you all know, made the protection and promotion of human rights a centerpiece of his administration. And I was in the diplomatic service at the time, and I very much recall the sea change that took place in our foreign policy agenda when President Carter took that step. President Carter's continued commitment to human rights through the work of the Carter Center is well known throughout the world. But in addition to President Carter's leadership and role, what makes this gathering uniquely inspiring is all of you. You have traveled from all parts of the world to be with us for these few days, and we are very, very grateful for the time and effort you have devoted to this undertaking. Now, previous forums have produced remarkable outcomes, including President Carter's best-selling book, A Call to Action. But this is just one example, albeit a very good one, of what has been accomplished in previous years. So I take this opportunity to invite each of you to consider the actions and commitments you can take to put into action what we are discussing here. In effect, this is a 4-day conversation among an impressive and accomplished group of human rights, religious, and political leaders with a common goal: to reduce and, God willing, someday eliminate violence against women and girls in our world. This morning actually marks the halfway point, as most of you have already been in discussions since Saturday in the working groups, and we'll hear more about that after opening remarks from President Carter and our representative from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. But first, as is our custom, I have just learned, our program will begin with music. And since I am tone deaf, I turn to Karen Ryan to introduce this year's song.
Well, this is a particular pleasure for me. I always have music, he knows. I even got to sing at his birthday party, which was such a treat. His favorite song, Imagine, by John Lennon, so cool. But this song is so special. Last year at 1 Billion Rising, which is an amazing movement, and we have representatives from 1 Billion Rising, Pat Mitchell, Lisa Parsons. There's a large group here from 1 Billion Rising, which is a global movement to bring attention to women's rights. So last year, I met this remarkable artist named Breeze. He's an inspirational musician. Sometimes we call it gospel, but the real word, the correct title is inspirational music. And he sang this beautiful song about violence against women, and wants to use his platform to address violence. And through his religion, through his religious identity as a person of faith. And so we just immediately hit it off. We started talking about this work. I told him about President Carter's book, and about the message of what are we going to do about violence. So he wrote this song for us about this and dedicated it to us. And our hope, and we want your full participation in this, is to create a video that will go worldwide with this message. And after this conference, we're going to be making that happen. And so I want to introduce Breeze and Rotana, who comes from Saudi Arabia. She's singing with him. And she herself has faced backlash for being a visible artist as a woman. And if you listen to her words, I think you will be very moved. And I introduce to you Breeze and our choir.
The crucial question of our time is how to overcome oppression and violence without resorting to oppression and violence.
It's a cold, cold war, but what are we fighting for? It's a vicious cycle, a constant greed for more. We need each other, so why do you hate your brother? We're all in this thing together. We need love. Love is the answer. Oh, love. Love is the answer. Talk about love. Love is the answer. L-O-V-E, love. Love is the answer. Oh, love. Love is the answer. But love. Love is the answer. Hey.
Lay low by violence, made still by silence. Women and children abused, stand up for justice. Don't change the subject. People are rightly accused. Where is the love?
Love is the answer.
Love,
Love is the answer.
love,
Love is the answer.
L-O-V-E,
Love is the answer. Love is the answer. Love is the answer. Imagine a world walking hand in hand.
We the people united.
If you believe we can, let's teach our children. Future's in their hands. Hate is the cancer. That's why love is the answer. Love. Oh, love. Oh, love. I'm talking about L-O-V-E, love. Oh, love, oh, love, oh, love. No violence or hate. We won't discriminate. No more social injustice. No more. No. 'Cause we need love. It's all we need. It's all we need, yeah. I tried and all I found was love. Oh, love. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Wasn't that great? Just wait 1 minute while we get a couple of photos.
If you'll just be patient with us, we're having a webcast, so we're having some banners put up. It'll just take us.
All right, let me know when. Ready?
Yep.
Okay. And now it is my very great honor to introduce someone who needs no introduction, the spirit behind the Human Rights Defenders Forum, the 39th President of the United States of America, Nobel Peace Laureate Jimmy Carter.
Thank you. Thank you, Marianne. Okay, what is the answer?
Love.
Love.
Okay, what is the answer?
Love.
Right. Okay, very good. Well, I'm very grateful to all of you participants who've come here, I understand, from 20 different countries, and we appreciate that music very much, which is a good way for us to get started and also to help us continue with this work, because love and not hate, peace and not war, human rights and not violations is really the answer. We're grateful to have a number of people here that are special. We have representatives here from the Alexandria Library in Egypt. We have religious leaders from Ghana and Senegal, including, I understand that Chief Imam Sheikh Osman Nuhu Shurabutu is coming. His plane is a little bit delayed, but he'll be here. And as you know, he and his associates have been working on peace and justice and also women's rights in Ghana, which is a very good move. We have activists here from Colombia and Mexico. And they have seen and will testify, I think, that the war on drugs, which is almost totally related to violence, has led to excessive violence and concentrated this violence against women and girls, not surprisingly. Later on this morning, U.S. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand will be here. She's a U.S. Senator from New York, and she's been, I would say, the #1 champion of basic human rights for women and girls in America, in the United States Senate and into our Congress. I met with her recently when I was on my book tour. Last year, we discussed the main subject of violence and also religious misbeliefs causing violence against women. And I determined after that session that I would write a book, because I saw and still see now that the #1 violation of human rights in the whole world is the deprivation of human rights of women and girls. The book was called A Time for Action: Women, Religion, Violence, and Power. And I think we can see that the struggle to interpret religions properly, both Christianity and Islam and all the others, is a very important element. The resort to violence instead of peace is another cause of the abuse of women and girls. And the struggle for power, where men don't want to give it up, is another very serious source of problems. We've discussed in my book and also at the session last year the problems with human trafficking, that is slavery. We know that slavery now is greater in cross-border trafficking in human beings than it was even during the 18th and 19th centuries. And this is a horrible situation that we're going to address a little bit later this May, working with the Rotary Clubs of the world to deal with this particular issue. We also know that child marriage is abominable, with 8, 10, 12-year-old girls being sold into virtual slavery through marriage. Not too long ago, my wife and I were in Nepal, and we met with a group of young women who had escaped from brothels. And they met with us and discussed it very frankly, what had happened to them and why they got caught in that horrible crime. And I asked them at the end, would you rather be sold into slavery in a brothel, or would you rather be sold into slavery in marriage? And all 18 of them said we would rather be prostitutes because we have some chance for success in escaping than we would be to be sold into a child marriage. Honor killings is horrible. We know that this is the number one cause of murder, for instance, in Jordan. The Jordanian king and queen are struggling against it, but they have a very strong bureaucracy in Jordan and other countries that prevents our correcting this horrible problem of murdering young women who quite often are the victims of assault or rape by strangers, and they're looked upon as having brought disgrace on their own families, and sometimes they are killed by their own family members. Most of the time by their father or their uncle, quite often in Egypt about 25% by their mothers, and increasingly by young brothers who, because of their youth, will not be punished severely because of they have committed murder against their own sisters. In the United States, we've had a long discussion, which I'm sure Senator Gillibrand will pursue this morning, about rape and sexual abuse on campuses. This is a subject that I've addressed quite a lot. In fact, just recently I've been at Harvard and Yale and Princeton University, and I teach at Emory University. And about almost 100 universities in the United States now have been singled out for deep investigation by the Department of Education because they permit rape of girls on college campuses, even the most distinguished universities on earth, and the boys who commit those rapes do it with impunity. Very rarely is a young man on a campus who is a serial rapist quite often. Very rarely are they punished for their crime. When I spoke about this at Harvard and Yale, there was an uproarious applause from a large crowd that came there when I said, how many of you would like to have a serial rapist stay on your campus like your president seems to do? And it was very embarrassing to the college president when I said that. And of course we know that in the U.S. military, and this is something that Senator Gillibrand has talked about particularly, in our own United States military, there are about 20,000 sexual assaults every year. And quite often the girls who report that they have been assaulted on a military base are punished and not the rapist who is not punished. These are the things that go on today. In Atlanta, we found out last year that more than 200 people are sold into slavery every year in the city where we are located right now. And the reason for that is that Atlanta has by far the largest, busiest airport in human trafficking in the world. And a lot of our customers come from the southern hemisphere, where the girl's skin is brown or black. And we found out that a brothel owner in this region of the country can buy one of those girls into sexual slavery for about $1,000. And that's what perpetuates and continues slavery in the United States of America. Last year, the State Department reported that 60,000 people are living today in the United States in bondage as slaves. These are just examples of abuse. I would say the worst and least described abuse is the infanticide of baby girls. In the World War II, which is the worst conflict we've ever had in history, there were about 45 million people killed in all the nations in the world. There are almost 4 times that many, about 160 million girls missing now from the face of the earth. The 2 largest countries on earth are China and India. In China, for every 100 girls, there are 118 boys. Where are the other 18 girls out of every 100? In India, there are 112 boys for every 100 girls. These are caused by the restrictions on family sizes imposed mandatorily by the government. But in other places where poverty is prevalent, the parents want to have few children to feed, and they prefer boys. I think erroneously. Girls would probably be much nicer to their parents in their parents' old age. But the parents deprive the girls in poverty of a chance for education and a good job so they'll be able to support their parents. These are the kind of things that go on. In the last chapter of my book, I list 23 different actions that all of us can take. Every human being on earth, every organization on earth, every government on earth can take to correct some of these problems. I've had a lot of chances to be on radio and television shows, and I've just mentioned that I went to 3 universities recently. I also spoke to the Islamic Society of North America. About 12,000 people were there in Detroit, Michigan. These are very wonderful believers in Islam. And at the end of that session, they had brought in to their conference a large group of imams from around the world. And the last thing on the program was they signed a covenant that when they go back home to their countries, they will do all they can to convince the people that the Quran, the Holy Scripture, calls for equality of treatment between men and women. And of course, we have the same problem in Christianity and other religions, as you know. I also spoke to the American Academy of Religion. These are mostly professors and others who teach religion and theology in our major universities. And there were about 10,000 of them there. Because I believe that the misinterpretation of the Holy Scriptures is one of the main causes of the abuse of women and girls. In addition, Karen and I have contacted the members of the parliaments of Canada and Ireland and France to encourage them to correct their misinterpretation of what to do about prostitution. Nobody particularly wants prostitution, but there's not a whorehouse in America or a brothel, whatever you want to call it, that's not known by the local police on the streets. They know when men and women, when men go in to be customers and come right back out in a few hours. And either the policeman is told by his chief of police, don't bother the prostitution, or the mayor and city council of a community knows about it. And what this does is bring these female prisoners into a place like Atlanta. They're sold into brothels, and they become unwilling sexual partners. We're trying to get all these countries to change their laws. In the United States, for every single pimp or male customer or brothel owner that's arrested, there are 25 girls that are arrested for the crime. And this needs to be changed, and these countries are changing it. They're going to prosecute the brothel owners and the pimps and also the male customers instead of just arresting the girls, who quite often are innocent and are suffering from involuntary slavery. Now, last week I was in London, and I had a chance to meet with the Secretary of State of International Development. This is one of the main financiers of programs in the Carter Center and around the world. Excuse me, and we had a long talk about what Great Britain can do to deal with these problems that I've just discussed. Well, let's get down to this forum, which is mainly how women must lead in the fight against violence in particular. We have to continue this dialogue to address violence against women and extremism in all countries, including the United States of America. The United States is not the worst country in the world, but we're the leading country in the world. And when our Congress and our president and so forth don't take women's rights as a top priority and the abuse of women as a top concern, then the rest of the nations kind of breathed a sigh of relief and said, we don't have to do anything about it either. So this needs to be done. We need a constant website, an easy access website, so we can communicate back and forth, and so all the leaders in the whole world can find a common way to discuss their problems, their challenges, and also their opportunities for change. We have to remember that violence against women and girls is the same as torture and should be outlawed and condemned everywhere it exists. Extremism is terrible. We've seen what IS does, ISIS, or ISIL, whatever you want to call it. But quite often the violence is escalated even by those that oppose extremism. And we have to remember that all of us are culpable and all of us can do something about the increased use or condoning of violence. And the more violence becomes accessible or accepted as a norm, the more violent it becomes, particularly concentrated, as you well know, against women and girls. Well, the life experiences of girls in our communities, in our homes, in our nations, in the international community, is quite often undervalued and not appreciated. And we need to make sure that those women who know about the abuse of themselves and their compatriots and their girls, their daughters, will have a chance to use their natural inclination against violence in the higher levels of the intersection of trade, commerce, and ideas among nations. This is a very important thing. United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 guarantees, not yet carried out, that women will be deeply involved in every peace negotiation in the world. Because the women know what peace means, and they know what war costs themselves, their families, their daughters, their children, and even their husbands. Well, I look forward to the next session that we'll have here in May with the Rotary Clubs. I already mentioned that, on human trafficking or slavery. And I can tell you that everything that we do in the future must be oriented toward using our voice as best we can in other forums. We're not competing with other people who deal with this problem. We want to be their supporter. We want to strengthen their efforts. The White House Summit on Countering Violent Extremism. There's a 20-year review of the Beijing Platform for Action. And also there's a 15-year review of United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325. And also, as you know, the United Nations is now developing a new set of sustainable development goals. And we hope that the treatment of women and girls is one of those goals that has to be corrected nation by nation in order to improve the status and the reputation of that particular country. Well, we're deeply involved in this with you. We appreciate your coming and joining with us. And I can tell you this, the Carter Center, and I personally, and my wife, and Karen, and Marianne, none of us will ever abandon this effort. You can depend on us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And now we have the privilege of hearing from Gaynell Curry, who's representing the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Just a minute, I'm going to talk about you. Okay. Gaynell is the Gender and Women's Rights Advisor in the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Office in New York. In her 16-year career with the UN, Gaynell has worked on human rights issues in East Timor, Afghanistan, and South Sudan. And in South Sudan, she set up the system's first women protection advisors as part of the UN response to conflict-related sexual violence. Gaynell.
Thank you. Mr. President, Mrs. Carter, Madam Ambassador, distinguished colleagues and friends, I think we can call ourselves friends. We've had some very frank and interesting discussions over the last few days. Lots of attacks on the UN, which is great. We always love to hear what we're doing wrong so we can try to do it better. We love it, so keep it coming. It is timely that we're meeting on this issue. And President Carter just mentioned these things as well, because they're intrinsically linked to the issue of gender equality and the rights of women to participate, lead and shape development both in the private and public sphere. And I'm saying it's timely because we have the 20th anniversary of Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action to assess where we are, and that's coming up, to assess where we are as a world community in terms of the enjoyment of human rights by women. At the end of 1995, at the Beijing meeting, governments committed to taking measures to ensure gender equality and women's empowerment through, for example, their equal access to full participation in power structures and decision-making. And that was a long time ago. The international community will also commemorate 15 years of 1325, another milestone. This was the genesis of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, which calls for increased representation and participation of women at decision-making levels in the prevention, management, and resolution of conflict. And I think given the level of the discussions that I've heard here this past few days, I think it would be really very good if some of the recommendations coming out of this discussion that we're having can feed into these review processes. I know there's still room, perhaps for consideration in the review process for 1325. I know that they're really open to ideas and suggestions coming forward, and if somehow we can put together our thoughts and the brilliant ideas that are coming out this weekend to inform those processes and come up with really action-oriented responses as how to engage women in building peaceful societies, I think that would be a very useful and interesting outcome of this session. So the recurring question for me in preparing for this session was, how do we actually build peaceful societies? And for me, an inclusive society must be based on respect for all human rights and fundamental freedoms, cultural, religious, and other forms of diversity, social justice, and the needs of marginalized and disadvantaged groups in our societies. Democratic participation and the rule of law is key. It is promoted by social policies that seek to reduce inequalities, including gender inequality, and that create flexible and tolerant societies and embraces all human beings. So the full participation of both women and men in the governance, development, and prosperity of their societies has long been recognized in international law. It's referred to in the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. It's referred to in the Covenants on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights, and the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. It's also further elaborated in the CEDAW Convention, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. Special procedures of the Human Rights Council, like the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women, these all refer to the issue of participation. 1325, as you just mentioned, other resolutions of the Security Council, 1889, 2122, and the list goes on and on. I think it is clear that governments understand what this actually means. The challenge, as we've heard here, is how do we implement? And that's where I think we're stuck. How does this sort of all of this legal theory, all of these decisions, all of these recommendations, how do they translate to realization of rights of women and girls around the world? We know that the main barriers for equality and full participation of women and girls in society is discrimination and stereotyping, which is usually even more pronounced for women for indigenous peoples, minorities, those with disabilities, human rights defenders. They're attacked and continue to be attacked all around the world, migrants and other marginalized groups of women. And most recently, we've seen terrorism and violent extremism impeding the full participation of women and girls, including through attacks on them in the education sphere. Structural discrimination and gender stereotyping is at the base of this violence against women and girls, prohibiting their right to education and the full gamut of rights that they are guaranteed under this listing of conventions that all of our governments have really signed on to and said they commit to. So we've heard in the news, and several times here this weekend actually, about the 200+ Nigerian girls who were kidnapped from a school by the group Boko Haram. And while some have escaped, the majority is still missing, unfortunately. and reportedly have been trafficked or sold or forced into marriage. We have also heard in the news about incidents such as poisoning and acid attacks against schoolgirls in Afghanistan. I heard these stories firsthand when I served in Afghanistan, and I had actually the privilege to share the office with an Afghan colleague who expressed to me his fear. He wanted his girls to go to school, and he personally walked them every morning, he or his brother. He wouldn't allow anybody or anybody else, and he wouldn't allow them to walk on their own. The school was not very far away, but he expressed that fear that he had every day as his girls walked down the street to go to get what is rightfully theirs, a right to education, a right to access education. I saw similar fears on the face of women in Rumbek in South Sudan when they indicated that they really wanted their young girls to go to school and not to be married as children, which was being encouraged and forced on them, and they were being threatened in some cases with acts of violence if they did not allow their daughters to be married. So this is really a phenomenon that I've seen in almost every duty station I've served in and many missions that I've participated in on behalf of the United Nations. So the reported forced removal of girls from school in Somalia to become wives of al-Shabaab fighters, we've heard of that. And the shooting of education activist Malala, we've heard of that by the Taliban. And I recall what the Secretary General said when that shooting happened. He said, why is a girl with a book so threatening for a man with a gun? And that sort of resonates with me still to this day, because we still have those concerns, and girls are being attacked every single day in school environments on the way to school. And I call it the educational sphere because it's not only in the school, it's on the way to school, it's in after-school activities. As the President just mentioned, it's on university campuses here. They're under attack and fighting this situation of violence. According to our UN reports, attacks on schools is at least it has happened in at least 70 different countries, 70 different countries between 2009 and 2014, with a number of these attacks being specifically directed at girls, parents, teachers, and human rights defenders who are fighting, who are advocating every single day for the rights of girls to access education. In addition to these targeted attacks, of course, we have the everyday attacks that they face and challenges that they face to get approvals even within their homes from their fathers and their brothers and their uncles to go to school. So they're being pushed back even in their own homes, and we know that women are often under attack in their homes due to domestic violence, but girls are also facing similar attacks. And you know, I was listening to a colleague from Libya, and she was speaking so highly of her father, who has really promoted the education of his daughters and pushed her to a certain extent and held her up in her endeavors to become a medical doctor. And we commend that, and we don't always speak fondly of those fathers who do support. And we need more fathers like that, and more fathers like the ones, like my colleague back in Afghanistan, who's determined to hold his little girl's hand and walk her to school every single day. And regardless of what's happening around and attacks around, ensuring that they create a better way and life for their daughters. And OHCHR just this morning in Geneva, launched a report specifically on this issue and attacks against girls in the education sphere. So we entitled that Attacks on Girls Seeking Access to Education. So it's an attack on education. And the report reiterates the issues of gender discrimination, inequalities that they face, and the tragic attacks that they're suffering, and how this impedes on a whole range of rights. And it's a devastating thing for communities and nations, and we heard our colleagues from Nigeria here speak about that. It's devastating for them, what's happening to the girls. But I think it's far more than we can even imagine, devastating for the girls themselves. They're forced into marriage, they're trafficked, they're forced into slavery, they are forced into sexual and labor exploitation, and the list goes on and on. They're also connected to, these are also connected to other violations, as I mentioned already, the right to health, We don't understand the extent to which this impedes the rights of health of girls when they're forced into early marriages, they're forced into early pregnancies, and many young girls die as a result of violations such as these I'm listing here. And I mean, attacks on schools, and I think I was so happy to see that this report was coming out from the Office of the High Commissioner, because it really is one of the key issues, I think a major impediment to development of peaceful societies, which we're speaking here today. In order to have that peaceful society, we need to have those safe spaces for girls. An education environment should be a safe space for a girl, and not a place where they're under attack. You shouldn't have to defend yourself to get your education if you're 7 years old or 8 years old or a child of even a teenager. There's a challenge to that we really as an international community need to condemn more forcefully and come up with more concrete actions as to how we can actually respond to that. So in addition to these attacks, I wanted to discuss a little bit about the broader issue of gender terrorism and violent extremism, which reveals itself as the first battlefield, I think, for women in these extremist environments. So a woman's body becomes the first, or her rights becomes the first thing under attack when we have these sorts of environments of extremism. So under the Taliban, as I mentioned already about the attacks against girls in school, but the laws that changed, that suddenly impeded women, and we know that Afghanistan in the past was a country where you had educated women. And with the Taliban, all of that there was an attack on that, and a backpedaling of on the gains that have been achieved over those years. And suddenly women were not allowed to go to school, or were not to access school beyond the age of 8, except in the case of the study of the Quran. And the punishment for trying to enjoy your rights or fulfill the rights that were guaranteed you under international law, those women were flogged and killed in certain circumstances. And UN reports that there are similar attacks in Iraq and Syria, and we've heard some of them already from Somalia and Mali, just to name a few. But in 70 different countries, girls have been attacked on the way to education. They continue on the way to school and educational activities. They continue to be attacked in the context of extreme terrorism and violence. And according to the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and this came out recently in the statement, if any of you had a chance to read that statement by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, he recently spoke in Washington at the Holocaust Museum and the 70th anniversary of Auschwitz. And he spoke about the challenges, the types of environments, if you will, that impede, or that rather than impede, that actually facilitate this type of extremism. And he says that we need to be able to identify these types of environment by the type of violations that we see, and they're usually against girls and women. They're warnings, they're early warnings to us that we need to act as an international community. Prevention and response requires a better understanding of the condition in which violent extremism flourishes. It flourishes when there are no real recognition and acceptance of rights across the board. A society that is built on the rule of law, which has as its core the fundamental values of Universal Declaration for Human Rights and other international laws, is a society that is fortified against terrorism. I wish I could say tourism. I'm from the Bahamas, so excuse me, tourism is often on my mind. Terrorism. So ensuring effective institutions of governance and access to justice and political participation and personal security, ensuring full participation, these are the things we need to end or to address these environments that breed these terrorist activities. But what we say in the UN is these environments, the type of environment that we're trying to create is also the environment that will help to maximize development gains. And we've heard in our discussions that a lot of this is about poverty. It's about socioeconomic challenges that women face, that people face around the world more broadly. And so they're fighting back against these injustices, inequalities, lacks, if you will, of opportunities and other economic and social development chances. So they're pushing back on that, and we see that we see that the terrorist activities are really linked in some way to these types of concerns. The CEDAW, I'm going to go back to another. I know I was told this weekend that you speak a lot about laws, and there are a lot of them, but I wanted to mention one last one. The CEDAW committee has adopted this landmark resolution, general recommendation, general recommendation 30 on women in conflict prevention, conflict and post-conflict situations. And I think this is a very useful tool in helping us to understand that rights apply across the board. They don't only apply in times of peace, they apply in times of war, always. And I think because of the breakdown in society and the breakdown of social structures during war, we tend to forget, and there's a free-for-all, and human rights are the first things that go out the window, and among those, usually right up front, is the rights of women. So we need to remember that these rights are rights that are maintained at all times, not at selective opportunities and selective groups, and for selective groups of persons. And the recommendation stresses the need for concerted and integrated approaches between agendas. The counterterrorism agenda should somehow be linked to the women, peace and security agenda, should somehow be linked to what we're talking about in terms of human rights. And we've heard that this weekend, and it's something that we're quite aware of in the UN. And these several different parts of the system must come together more comprehensively and see the interlinkages. I like to say that it's all, the base of it all is human rights. Some may argue with me and say that it's about humanitarian protection of civilians and so forth, but I think it's really about rights, fundamentally about rights. And we need to do it better in the UN in terms of coordination, in terms of how we actually ensure that our programs, our initiatives are comprehensive and reach the persons that need them most. And I know my colleagues are saying, I'm happy she's remembering these things. I listened, and and that you know, these programs that we develop are actually, we do so in collaboration with our partners on the ground, all of you that are working in these very tough and difficult situations, and we admire your work and commend your work and want to support that work. And I will just end on a statement by my High Commissioner that he also made last week when he participated in the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And he identified something that my colleague here from Uganda mentioned the other day, that what's really missing in this whole discussion about building of peaceful societies is the issue of leadership. We have had over the years, and we see leadership at the table with President Carter, who speak out on issues of gender equality and on human rights. We need more of it. The High Commissioner said, and I'm quoting him, "Profound and inspiring leadership across the globe is what is needed in response to terrorism and violent extremism. We need leadership that is concerned more about reputation based on whether human rights and fundamental freedoms are defended and promoted. This includes all rights, political, civil, economic, social, and cultural. We need leaders who will observe fully these laws and treaties drafted to end all discrimination, deprivation of millions, and atrocity of access in war with no excuses entertained. Only then can we help ourselves out of the present serious, seemingly inexhaustible supply of crises that threaten and engulf us and that threaten our women and girls." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gaynell. Now Susan Thistlethwaite, Working Group Rapporteur, will summarize the conclusions from the 2 days of discussions that took place over the weekend. Susan has become an ongoing advisor to our Mobilizing Action for Women and Girls program because of her work as a theologian, women's rights activist, and innovative thinker on nonviolence and just war theory. Susan is a professor of theology at Chicago Theological Seminary, and she served as its president from 1998 until 2008. She's the author of numerous books. She writes a weekly column for the Washington Post's On Faith section, and she's a frequent media commentator. Now, Susan will give us an overview of the discussions and outcomes from this weekend's working group sessions, and there will be time for discussion after her report. Susan?
Thank you very much, Ambassador. So I got the title for this from our musical presentation. I'm going to call it No More Changing the Subject. So we have had 2 days of intense meetings, nearly 70 scholars, activists, religious leaders from 20 countries attending this Human Rights Defenders Forum, Beyond Violence, Women Leading for Peaceful Societies. And we have sought to build on the work set forth in former U.S. President Jimmy Carter's recent book, A Call to Action, Women, Religion, Violence, and Power. The situation faced by women and girls around the world is getting worse. It is accelerating. As one conference attendee said, violence is becoming more brutal because it is becoming more normalized. But as another attendee pointed out, we dare not just deal with emergencies. Yes, we do have to deal with emergencies. We all know that, including the person who said that, to relieve immediate suffering and to meet basic human needs. But we also recognize that we must shift from fear to confidence, from a violent frame, such as the war on terror, or any subsequent formulations that just mean endless war, to a frame that sets us on the path to solutions, or the suffering will only increase. Despite the additional burdens this puts on everyone in the room and all those you know so well who are already working so hard on meeting these needs, it is widely agreed among this group that proactive, long-term strategies are crucial for preventing, reducing violence against women and the scourge of war. One achievement of this conference was to celebrate the United Nations Security Resolution 1325, Women as Active Agents in Peace and Security, as recognized by the UN in 2000, but also to recommend that more is needed. It has become clear there are strong barriers to implementation of this resolution, and member states have been slow or resistant in developing their national action plans. One member of our group said 1325 was an achievement, but we have hit a plateau. Engaging religion is where there is new creativity possible. So I have framed the remainder of this summary as drivers of violence and drivers of change, because I am attempting to show how all of you in your groups saw these in tandem, in dialogue, and in conflict. There was wide agreement that addressing violence against women and the abuses of their human rights means addressing root causes. This was universal. Many root causes involve disproportionate power among different groups that sustain existing unequal realities, religious interpretations that are used to support the denigration of women, lack of education or miseducation of both women and men, lack of enforcement of laws and mandates that would reduce or prevent violence against women, and the increasing relationship of globalized economics and militarization. And these root causes are also the central moral issues with which we wrestle. The drivers of change are linked to these and need to address them systematically, clearly, and in a sustained fashion. It is necessary, you all said, and all the charts on the walls had lines driven, this connects to this, to this, to this, to this. Because one driver cannot be addressed in a silo. It is crucial to address multiple drivers of silence simultaneously, because there is no one that is the only one that leads to violence. And peace projects must address drivers simultaneously because they are mutually reinforcing. So I've identified 4. The first is religious interpretation. Creativity and engaging religion, as identified at the 2 days of small group discussions, was coupled with a rigorous critique of the ways religious interpretation can be an enabler of violence against women and an enabler of conflict and violent extremism, especially in concert with corrupt regimes or criminal extremist groups that pervert religion and turn it to their own ends of power and acquisition. Other religious interpretations are needed. In order to address this root cause, we have to identify the institutions, you said, the religious leaders, the teachers, the preachers, who have an ability to influence a large amount of people to change mindsets. It is important as a countermeasure to create space for peacemakers and activists on violence against women to come together with religious influencers, to help them understand how the implications of their teachings and their ability to make change are interactive. It's important also for peacemakers and activists to recognize that, and I will include myself in this, our ways of dealing with violence are also not working all that well. The strategies used by states and by peacemaking rights activists also need to be up for examination. A dialogue is needed where peace builders and activists push religious leaders, but we need to be flexible and open as well to being pushed. And this is the nature of a true dialogue. Religion has tremendous power to prevent and interrupt violence against women, and to interrupt and prevent violent extremists. In many contexts, religion can be a powerful ally in reconstructing societies for greater participation of women as equal partners, in promoting human security and human rights. This takes concerted effort, and these efforts must be supported and sustained. 2, power. Violence against women, including especially physical and sexual assault, as well as psychological harm, should be regarded in a similar category to torture and rejected as outside of moral and legal norms. Torture has been called a spectacle of power. And in the same way, violence against women creates a spectacle of power as control and domination. This type of power as total dominance is a root cause of violence. It can operate at the familial, communal, religious, institutional, national, and international level. Women internalize this dominance and come to believe they do not have the right to speak or to live free of violence, and they do not think there is anyone to protect them. One basic driver of change, therefore, is giving agency to women. And there were many excellent suggestions on how this can be done. Power now, you said, is dominated by a few, but a more collective approach to power can be built by collaboration, power sharing among groups in a society that are working on ending violence against women and ending conflict and violent extremism. But these types of coalitions are fragile and can easily be taken down by force or fear. Safe spaces for difficult conversations that can change the power dynamics in society and further collaboration across differences, you said, are very much needed. And again, many have strong examples of how they are working on this specific issue. Education, that was strongly presented as well here. Education was a crucial issue you mentioned over and over as a driver for the oppression of women and for conflict through miseducation and undereducation. But you also said it is a crucial driver of positive change. I would say, I put one statement from me in here, the denial of education to women is a form of institutionalized violence against them. The state should promote gender justice within education. Beginning at the primary level, equality, nonviolence, social justice should all be in the education of both girls and boys, and women and men. Otherwise, education systems actually contribute to conflict and can become a trigger for violence against women, as we so powerfully just heard. Religious schools, as well as public and government-run schools, need to be helped to teach these values. Popular culture was examined as an educator and a powerful force in helping to create a culture of violence against women, and the idea that violence is an acceptable way to solve problems. Popular culture was also lifted up as a way to engage, especially young people, in realizing violence against women and girls is wrong, and that the use of violence does not solve problems, it actually causes problems. Enforcement, so strongly discussed in all groups. It was widely agreed it's a root problem. We do not lack for good models of laws, and we do not lack great mandates, but we do not have the implementation and the enforcement. A climate of impunity about violence against women and violent conflict was mentioned in every group several times and by many of the speakers. The rule of law and law enforcement, you said, must be promoted. Otherwise, there cannot be any security. It is absolutely crucial that there be accountability mechanisms for perpetrators. In the case of child marriage, which President Carter mentioned, oftentimes laws are on the books, but they are not enforced. In many countries, women and girls are not safe from violence, even from the police and the military. It was also widely agreed nothing is possible without anti-corruption work. If, for example, there is true election reform with anti-corruption, one participant said, then things will change. And if we do not have that, nothing will change. Many states have the concept of democracy, but because of corruption, it does not happen. Drug trafficking, prostitution, trafficking in persons, and other criminal gang activities are profoundly corrupting to states, and often women are particularly vulnerable and the victims, and they are unprotected in failing states. There is an erosion of trust in governments, both national and international, linked to poor governance and corruption. And this must be a focus for rebuilding the very fabric of society. And finally, the fourth issue is economics. The normalization of violence and accelerating extremism that so drive violence against women today is a regression. It's a regression. It is important to recognize that gains were made in the last century, particularly the latter decades of the last century, on international rights, rights for women and girls, prioritizing women and girls in development work, the development of international coalitions for peace building and conflict resolution. We were making progress. And then the effects of global capitalism, the privatization of development, and the widespread militarization following 9/11 have eroded many of these gains. These erosions have meant that primary societal functions that increase health, prevent violence against women, and promote widespread economic participation of women and men are being done less and less by states and more by overburdened NGOs. Economic and social measures that accelerate migration, and especially illegal and unregulated labor migration, often linked to trafficking and slavery, are another root cause of violence against women, and they are seedbeds for extremism. Changing this driver of violence is enormously complicated. You said it. Think about how many things you listed on the board. There are many actors involved, and they are diverse actors. The financial sector, multinational corporations, country and global militarization, political regimes, as well as international agencies that work in these areas. Yet each of these sectors within the larger complex of economic shifts can be addressed. And you named many focused efforts that are directed at showing the enormous global costs of this violence and this conflict and the benefits, monetary benefits, social, political, and religious benefits of returning to conflict prevention and a multi-systemic approach that was beginning to be effective in the latter part of the last century, and that can, with concerted effort, be even more effective in this century. Over 2 days, scholars, activists, religious leaders, you've worked diligently, keeping the moral imperative in front of you that we must relieve mass human suffering. We must promote the dignity, respect for women and girls, and indeed for all persons. Long-term proactive strategies that will sustain and grow resilient, collaborative societies are truly the things that make for peace. Thank you. Okay.
What we wanted to do is open it up for Susan to moderate a discussion and give you all a chance to emphasize something that Susan said or insert something that you felt was really, really important from your perspective. We know that we're going to have a lot of time over the next 2 days to bring in your ideas in the different panels. So I would focus this discussion on anything that you'd like to highlight in Susan's report. And,
or I can just read you back your tweets, which,
so I ask you to put up your name tents. Put up your name tent, and we'll call Marwa. And okay, you want me to call her? Yeah. Let's start with Marwa Sharafuddin from Egypt. And please introduce yourself briefly.
Okay. My name is Marwa Sharafuddin. I'm from Egypt. I work with Musawa, the global movement for equality and justice in the Muslim family. Thank you very much for such an inspiring beginning to the day. I wanted to comment on the first point that Susan raised, the one on religious interpretation.
Can I just ask everyone who's speaking to speak slowly enough for the interpreters to be able to make sure everyone understands what you're saying? I appreciate it.
Sure. So Susan was mentioning that some of the discussions revolved around the importance to address institutions, religious leaders, to really make a change in the discourse, which I completely agree. This is part of what Musawa does. We are pushing forth a new discourse, a new Islamic discourse that supports equality and justice and provides solutions against violence against women from within that same discourse. And we have been working for many, many years with some institutions, with some religious leaders, but we have found that in many times we had to be very nuanced about these institutions because in many cases they themselves are mired into the politics that have in the first place created the situation we are in currently. And out of many tens and hundreds of religious leaders we have worked with, a huge investment, we come out with one or two. So it's important to work with this one or two or three individuals, extremely important. But we have also found out that maybe the investment should go elsewhere when we speak about religious interpretation. And the reason why violence is so pervasive is that there is this wide general acceptance for it, not just with religious leaders, but with people themselves. And for Muslims, if you work with Muslim women, if you work with Muslim men on this issue of religious interpretation, you have a much better chance sometimes to achieve a general acceptance to your message, a general acceptance. It's a personal thing, it's their faith. And we have found that in so many countries where we work, the silent majority is really waiting for this discourse, this alternative Islamic discourse that calls for equality, peace, justice, to come out. And it's not coming out from the religious institutions, because the religious institutions themselves are so embroiled in politics, they have to think twice before they talk about peace and equality. And I want to give you the example. Last week, after the burning of the Jordanian soldier at the hands of ISIS, the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, who's a person who's quite respectable, and he has been seen as the person who will spearhead this alternative Islamic discourse against violence. The statement that came out from him was that these ISIS people need to be crucified and their hands and legs cut off. And he used a verse in the Quran to support this. This is the same head of the institution that will lead us towards an alternative Islamic discourse towards equality and human rights. And that's why I think we need to be a bit more nuanced, a bit more careful when we speak about the ability of such religious institutions to lead the way. I'm not saying that we should not work with them. Absolutely. They have power, and we have to be able to negotiate with that. What I think needs to be done, for example, with institutions like this is to work with them on their curricula. So just, for example, a very simple thing, like introducing a gender course in Al-Azhar University. Just that. I mean, our sisters and brothers from Indonesia have successfully done that. And look where they have reached. Just to introduce gender as a category of thought. So when they teach Quran, when they teach Hadith, they teach also their students that you can also read the Quran from gender-sensitive eyes and look at the multitude of interpretations that can come out. So a very simple intervention like this can make wonders. And we have Indonesia, Malaysia, many other countries to lead forth. And so what I'm really saying is that if you speak to the people, and this is what we've been doing in Musawa for a very long time now, we found much higher rates of success when you speak with women who have been victims of violence. They are the best people who will carry forth this religious discourse. If you speak with civil society, with the women's movement, because they are in direct contact with the victims of violence, you have a much higher rate of success. When you speak with believers who really feel offended that their religion is taken in such a horrible way, you have a much higher rate of success. But when you speak with institutions and leaders, political leaders, who have political interests, I think we need to be strategic and careful and still work with them within the frame, within the area where both our interests can come together. Thank you.
I'm hearing you say two things, both emphasize the intersectionality, because we don't deal with religious interpretation as silo. That's helpful. And also, where are these new interpretations going to come from, right? Because they're not coming from within the institutions. So, thank you.
Next is Uni.
Yeah. Okay. President
Well, we have found in the last year or more that the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar has been one of our champion defenders of women's rights under the auspices of interpretation of Islamic text. And I don't disagree that when you cut off arms and legs, that's going to extremes. But do you think it's possible for the Al-Azhar University, which I understand has 120,000 students, to offer a course on the relationship between men and women under the auspices of the Quran? Is that being done yet?
It's not being done. This is what we want to start doing. Absolutely, and we will start discussions with them on this.
Do you still feel that he is being supportive of the basic premise of treating women equally with men?
I would think so, yes.
You think so?
Yes. But there's a big difference between the leadership of an institution and the different layers, the many, many layers underneath of that very same institution who are on a completely different wavelength when it comes to women.
Yeah, I've met with some of those layers as well as I am him. Yes, I know. Well, we might write him a letter suggesting that there be a course taken or offered at the Al-Azhar University for accurate interpretation of the scriptures.
I think it would be important to build on the knowledge, on the experience also of other Muslim universities, like in Indonesia, like in other, I mean, our colleagues here can also maybe help guide us, because when it's also coming from a Muslim, another fellow Muslim university, I think it also
I'm sure
helps.
Karen will feed me that information.
Right. So just what's really important, I love this, because when President Carter met with Sheikh Al-Tayeb, the Grand Imam, they discussed this, and he offered. And I think what's now for us to do, because we had representatives of Al-Azhar here a year and a half ago at our last meeting, and they committed to this idea of curriculum. They are in the midst of turmoil, but we have to hold them to this. Yeah. Dr. Azab, unfortunately, who was the one who made the commitment, passed away, but his colleague, Dr. Nosair, will honor it. So this is one of those examples of how we can build. Susan is going to call on, I think Andrea White was next.
Andrea. Oh, all right. Next on the list, Uni, where are you?
Thank you. First point, just information to following this discussion that for the GSW, Musawa and Komnas Perempuan in Indonesia, government will conduct Musawa side event on, and Indonesia will try to represent progressive Islam with another face of Islam. So maybe this is also another dialogue connecting between human rights and also Islam with a different color. I would like to ask Mr. President to also promote the rights and the protection of the migrant workers, because from the list, especially from the case of Indonesia, at least 1,000 women migrant workers killed or passed away because they become migrant workers. And also more than 200 still under the list of death penalty. So I think this is the big issues that we need to really to address, because this is also hiding huge impunity. Because this case happened in the receiving countries, in the destination countries. Some government prefer to send back home, and they bring a lot of lists of like unwanted pregnancy, children without father, they never meet the parents. So this is long list of issues behind the migrant domestic workers. And I would like to ask President and also from the High Commissioner of Human Rights to promote all the state members of the UN to ratify the International Convention on Migrant Workers, because this is the slowest and the lowest convention ratified by the member state. So this is, I think, if we talk about the impunity, this is also one of the important steps that we have to do. And I also would like to call all the important people here that when we talk about human rights, violence against women, we have to talk about the migrant domestic workers, and the role of the religious leaders is very important at our own state. Thank you.
And your thoughts were very much in my mind in writing the economic section, because it's very powerful. Why?
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Wewe from Myanmar. Thank you so much, President and the Carter Center, for inviting me here, because many of our mothers and sisters and daughters who cannot get this chance to be present here, to come here and to talk in this great stage, because almost all of my mother's sisters and daughters are being facing in a situation that living in a look like, sorry.
Okay.
So they're living in a situations like open prison. So they are being put in the prison in their village, so they cannot move even one village to another village. So I'm very grateful to be here and representing the minority from Burma in called Rohingya, who cannot identify their name as Rohingya. So what I was really inspired by the report from Ms. Susan, and what I want to highlight is we have been talking about the extremism and religion last 2 days, but in our case it's not really like extremism and religion itself happened, but it's state-sponsored. And it is state-sponsored violations of generation and ethnic cleansing. And in this stage, women and girls became victims because in our cause, state-sponsored structural violations is happening since decades ago, but we don't have that much attention. But women and girls are facing very difficult situations, even worse than other part of the world. Yeah, I would say that they are facing more difficult, even worse than the situations in women who are being sexual assault by the extremism in other part of the world. Women who are kidnapped in Boko Haram or ISIS or elsewhere, but our women are facing even worse situations, because they are living in totally insecure place and without having zero respect from the community and from the government, and without education in being open prison, and without education, without enough food, without livelihood, and with fear. So in this case, I would like to call attention from all human rights defenders and women's rights defenders to give attention on these state-sponsored violations, and those who are, but these violations is suffered by mostly women and girls, because men were fleeing from the country because of the persecutions, and they are able to flee from the country, but the remaining people are women and girls. So I would like to call all of you here today to pay attention, same attention to our cause to save the Rohingya women from the Burma. And it is happening and because of the state sponsor and total impunity for the account for the perpetrator. For example, in our country in 2012, violence state sponsored religious conflict happened and started from our state in Rakhine, and from that time to today, more than 400 women have been raped by the military and border security, border guard and security forces. But those even one case has been taken accountable yet. So that's why my request to all of you is to pay attention for those cases who are hidden in the wall faces.
Thank you. Why? Manal. Sorry, President Carter.
Wait.
President Carter gets dibs.
I'd like to talk to you privately later on about the Rohingya and the problems with them, because the Carter Center has a major presence in Myanmar, and we would like to have your advice on how we should have. So I'll see you later.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Great, thank you. Manal Omar with the U.S. Institute of Peace. I wanted to come back to the issue of working on religious leaders and focus in on how we can do it efficiently. And I think one of the things that we've really been able to do and mark progress in is identifying religious leaders as allies. I think, if we look 10, 15 years back, when we were talking about religious leaders, if we were doing a stakeholder analysis, they fit under the problem section. And I think women's rights have made some progress where we're realizing that there are allies and they can make us help change. And I think that was hard. A lot of us had a hard problem crossing over. There was a fear of, by talking to religious leaders, we're elevating them above the rule of law. It wasn't an easy decision. I think we're at a crossing point where we have, as women's rights defenders and human rights defenders, another hard question to ask ourselves, which is how have we engaged them in the past 10, 15 years? And I think that it's very easy to point out the failure of religious leaders, but I also think the way we have engaged, we need to really ask ourselves some tough questions. One of which is, there's a lot of power in the informal and the invisible. We're uncomfortable with women who want to be invisible. And I'll give you an example of Al-Azhar. Right now, there is a group of Egyptian women who, for the past few years, have been negotiating a declaration with Azhar on women's rights. This is a very sensitive declaration that can't be in the public eye. Now, obviously, the declaration will be in the public eye, but that negotiation is so sensitive, as our sister pointed out, because of political ramifications on all of this, that the approach in itself could be catastrophic if anything went out. And I think it's worth being invisible because of the final result. So really valuing the power of women who are seated at the side of the religious leaders. I think of Imam Sistani. Some of the women that were there were the ones who gave me access. I would not have been able to do the programs I did in Iraq without his fatwas. We need them. Same thing in Yemen. The other thing that I would say is, when we ask ourselves, let's look at police, let's look at the security sector, the first question we do when we do a mapping is, who has moral authority, right? That's one of the central questions in security. When we ask that question in religion, we get a backlash. But it's an essential strategic question. Who has moral authority? So although we can develop fatwas and we can develop interpretations outside of religious institutions, we need to accept we don't have moral authority. How can we build bridges with those that do? The other issue that I would ask is, again, going back to how do we engage? And I'm really happy to see that we engage. I mean, 10, 15 years, women used to be really upset with me when I would talk about religious leaders. Sorry, I'm speaking very fast. I know the translators hate me. Here's what I've seen from the ground and working all across Middle East and North Africa. We found our ways engaging in two ways. One is name and shame. And I think there's value. I'm not a huge person who doesn't believe in name and shame, but I also think, again, strategically, there has to be a parallel track if we are calling on accountability. So it can't only be name and shame in an aggressive manner, and that is a form of engagement, but I think that we have to be more conscious of the unintended consequences of the name and shame strategy. The other thing that I've seen done is where we will come and bring religious leaders to teach them about their religion. So I've been to many workshops where we're telling imams about Islam. And I think that that is just a tad bit condescending. Now, I want to thank the Asia Foundation because they brought me into a conference in Malaysia, which was a true dialogue, identifying some of the religious leaders and asking them questions, asking them strategies. And until today, I use some of the strategies based on the conversations I had with religious leaders who gave me very concrete examples of how this is not Islamic. And so I think we need to push ourselves into a little bit of this. Now I want to give you a personal example. Yesterday's morning conversation had me walk away feeling alienated and marginalized. Now I'm a girl who was raised in South Carolina. So I'm not a rural Middle Eastern woman who's raised in the farm like my parents were. I was raised in South Carolina. I studied gender studies, and I've dedicated the last 15 years to women's rights at great risk. So if I felt marginalized and alienated by the conversation, which in my opinion had a lot of inaccuracies about my religion, how do you think people in rural areas, in villages feel when they hear this conversation? And I think it's very naive for us to say, don't be defensive, develop thick skin, because this is religion. And we've said tactically and strategically, it's part of initiating change. So how can we really bring the discourse to a higher level? And I'm not speaking about feelings and stuff, which I think is equally important, but I'm also thinking about efficient strategy, where we can address the way we've done things as women's rights, human rights defenders. Again, I think Asia Foundation, Sisters of Islam in Malaysia, I mean, we have concrete good Women in Memory Forum in Cairo. of people who are doing it. But I would like to see that conversation elevated, so we're not trying to, again, name and shame and alienate, but we're really being inclusive in the conversations.
That's perfect. And I have a list of speakers here. We're going to break on time. And the update here is that Senator Gillibrand's flight is delayed. They've been texting me. They'll be about 15 minutes late. So what I propose is that we go ahead with the group photo right at 11 as planned. And then we will pick up the speakers list. And they're going to be texting me. I'll know exactly when she's coming in so that we can adjust and take full advantage of Senator Gillibrand's presence with us. So this is wonderful beginning because what we promised is a conversation. And I want to say something to Manal about what you just said, because I think at the outset of this conversation, we said we have at least four different communities that have come together for this meeting. We have women that work through a human rights or secular framework. We have women who work on issues through a religion framework. We have peacemakers working on the religious intersection, and we have peacemakers working on the intersection with women. These are four different communities who never, hardly ever, sit in conferences for 2 days in workshops. Mm-hmm. And so there is, and accept my apology if anyone was offended or hurt by a conversation that has happened, because we knew when we brought people together, some of this would come. So I hope you'll accept that as just knowing that we are all here for the same purpose, to advance human rights, to end violence and promote peace, and to focus specifically on women. But I'm so grateful that you've expressed that, and I ask all of us to understand that we are here with the same purpose. So please, if your nameplate is up, I've written your name down. And this is very exciting because it means we're off to a great start and we are in conversation with each other. We're going to break now, have some coffee, and we've given you very long breaks because we want these conversations to continue on the breaks. I hope you appreciate that. They're not 15 minutes, they're 30 minutes. And that's for a purpose. So please take full advantage of that. I'm going to ask you, though, that when it's time to reconvene, we have to move quickly to get the photograph. These banners will be moved aside for the photograph. We'll get the photograph, but in order for that to happen, you need to be ready at 10:59 up on the risers. So I'm going to make you sing, by the way, when you get up on the risers. So please respect when we flash the lights and we yell and we go like this. It means because we really want you to have this treasure, which is this group photograph that everyone loves. So please cooperate with us in this regard. Thank you.